Chapter 7. The Economic Tasks of the Soviet Power During the Civil War. The Constitution of the Russian Socialist Federative Soviet Republic, adopted by the All-Russia Congress of Soviets, July 1918, summed up the main results of the first gains of the Great October Socialist Revolution. The Constitution of the RSFSR, created under the leadership of Lenin, Stalin and Sverdlov, formalized in the legislative order the formation of a new state, a state of the dictatorship of the working class in the form of the power of the Soviets. This is a new, genuinely democratic state based on the fraternal alliance of dozens of nationalities, on the alliance of the workers and the working peasantry against the exploiting classes. Fulfilling the will of the working people, the Constitution enshrined the transfer of land to the working peasants without any ransom. The land was declared public property. Soviet laws on workers' control, the creation of the Supreme Council of National Economy, the annulment of loans of the Tsarist and provisional bourgeois governments, and the nationalization of banks were confirmed. The Constitution consolidated universal labor service and proclaimed the historic slogan, "He who does not work does not eat." This first in the history of mankind constitution of the proletarian state was built on the basis of the Marxist-Leninist doctrine of socialism. However, the Soviet Republic could not deploy during this period its peaceful creative work on building socialism. In the first half of 1918, all the forces of the counter-revolution, both external and internal, united to fight against Soviet power. In the middle of 1918, a foreign military intervention and a civil war in the country began. Soviet Russia entered a new period of development, when the class struggle took on the most acute form. The respite came to an end. The exploiting class of our country, which were overthrown by the revolution, tried together with the world imperialist bourgeoisie to restore their domination with an armed struggle. The implementation of Lenin's plan for socialist construction was temporarily postponed because of the outbreak of civil war. Previously, the exploiting classes that were in power in their struggle against Soviet power relied on the international ties that they retained, to the aid of the imperialist bourgeoisie. They used the money and other assets that remained in their hands, their closeness to higher officials, to technical personnel, to officials of the state apparatus, their knowledge, the experience of organizing industry and military affairs, the vestiges of capitalism in the economy and in the minds of people. Survivals are particularly tenacious in small commodity production. The exploiters, along with their accomplices, the Mensheviks, socialist revolutionaries, bourgeois nationalists, sabotaged the activities of the Soviet government in order to strengthen the devastation in the country, disorganize the economic life and stifle the revolution with the bony hand of hunger. Not disdaining any methods, they tried to decapitate the revolution, disorganize its forces or, by making its way into the Soviet and party bodies, by undermining and killing Soviet and party workers from within. They organized conspiracies, insurrections and, finally, a civil war against the proletarian state. In the theses on the dictatorship of the proletariat, Lenin pointed out that the dictatorship of the proletariat is the continuation of the class struggle of the proletariat, in new forms. Lenin, Collected Works, Volume XXVP 5. Before the overthrow of the exploiters, the task of organizing the forces to overthrow the bourgeoisie and establish the dictatorship of the proletariat faced the working class. After the conquest of power by the working class, the goals and forms of the class struggle also change. Lenin points out 5 such new forms of class struggle. 4. 1. Suppression of the resistance of the exploiters. The opportunists and socialists completely forget about this, as the task and content of the epoch. From here, a special, higher, fierce class struggle. New forms of resistance, corresponding to capitalism and its a higher stage, plot sabotage impact on the petty bourgeoisie, etc. And in particular, 5. 2. The Civil War. Civil War in the Era of International Relations of Capitalism, IBED. p. 6. 6. 3. Neutralization of the petty bourgeoisie, especially the peasantry, in order to prepare a transition to an alliance with the middle peasant in the second stage of the revolution. 7. 4. Use of the bourgeoisie. Specialists. Not only the suppression of resistance, not only neutralization, but recruitment, coercion to serve the proletariat. 8. 5. The upbringing of a new discipline, IBID, p. 7. For the dictatorship of the proletariat is not only violence against the exploiters, but also the creation of a new, higher type of social organization of labor. The Bolshevik Party and its leaders, Lenin and Stalin, from the first days of the revolution, taught the working class and the working masses to remember that the class struggle in the country does not fade, but, on the contrary, worsens, for the overthrown exploiters are still strong and will repeatedly try to restore their power. The Marxist-Leninist doctrine of the class struggle during the transition period from capitalism to socialism was fully confirmed by the course of events after October 1917. In the second half of 1918, the Soviet Republic was surrounded on all sides by troops of foreign interventionists and White Guard gangs. During this period the Soviet Republic experienced enormous difficulties, an unprecedented food crisis. The factories did not have raw materials and fuel, and many of them stood. Soviet Russia was cut off from its main food regions, from the North Caucasus, Ukraine, the Volga region, Siberia, etc., from the country's main raw materials bases, Ukraine, Central Asia, etc., from the fuel and metallurgical centers of the country, the Donbass, Baku, the Urals, etc., the decisive regions for the production of bread, cotton, metal, coal and oil, that is, the most important items ensuring the normal development of the national economy, were cut off from Soviet Russia. In an extremely difficult situation was transport. All this created great difficulties in the defense of the country from the interventionists and the White Guards. It was difficult in this period in Soviet Russia. There was not enough bread. There was not enough meat. Hunger tormented the workers. The workers of Moscow and Petrograd were given a bread octopus for 2 days. There were days when they did not give out bread at all. The factories did not work, or almost did not work. There was not enough raw materials, fuel. But the working class did not lose heart. The Bolshevik Party did not lose heart. The incredible difficulties of this period and the desperate struggle with them have shown what inexhaustible energy lurks in the working class and to what extent the power of the authority of the Bolshevik Party is immeasurable. History of the CPSU, B. Short Course, p. 218. It was necessary to take extraordinary measures in order to ensure victory over the interventionists and White Guards in such a difficult economic and political situation, to restore the lost food, raw materials and fuel and metallurgical regions and establish an economy. For this it was necessary to subordinate everything to the main task of the period, to ensure victory on the fronts of the Civil War. The country was a besieged fortress, a military camp blocked from all sides. Therefore, the entire economic, cultural and political life of the country was rebuilt under the slogan that Lenin gave, "Everything for the front." It was necessary to place the rear in the service of the front. The Soviet government declared that the socialist fatherland was in danger and raised the people to a national war against foreign military intervention and White Guard riots. The economic policy of the Soviet government during this period was entirely subordinated to the tasks of the Civil War. Decree of the All-Russian Central Executive Committee of September 2, p. The Soviet Republic was proclaimed a military camp. This decree should now be enforced in all branches of economic activity and public administration. It is necessary to provide the army with supply and for this to increase labor productivity. It is necessary to provide the army and navy with food, as well as Moscow, Petrograd and all other centers of formation and labor. To do this, it is necessary to force all food and railway agencies in the center and in the localities to work with the highest tension and highest conscientiousness. Not only in the army and the navy, but also in food and transport, as well as in the field of military industry, should there be a military regime, that is, a strict labor discipline that corresponds to the situation of the country that the bandits of imperialism were forced to turn into a military camp. Collection of Laws and Orders of 1918, number 91, 92, art. 924. In accordance with the conditions of the military regime, in which the young Soviet Republic found itself, Soviet power introduced military communism. A short course in the history of the CPSU-B characterizes military communism as follows. The Soviet government placed, in addition to large-scale industry, medium and small industries, in order to accumulate consumer goods and supply them with an army and a village. She introduced a monopoly of grain trade, banned the private sale of grain and established a surplus purchase to take into account all the surplus food from the peasants, accumulate supplies of grain and supply the army and workers with food. Finally, she imposed universal labor service for all classes, involving the bourgeoisie in compulsory physical labor and thus freeing the workers for another, more important work for the front. The party carried out the principle, who does not work, does not eat. History of the CPSU-B short course, p. 219. The policy of war communism was a temporary policy dictated by the most difficult conditions for the struggle against interventionists and White Guards. It was a policy forced by war, intervention. The war of Soviet power against foreign interventionists and White Guards was a fair war, corresponding to the interests of the people. Foreign interventionists and White Guards with their war against the people, by violence and brutal reprisal with revolutionary elements, accelerated their own death. Institutions and enterprises that did not work for the front were reduced as much as possible. The dismissed cadres of workers were transferred to another job, necessary for defense. First of all, this applied to the communists. The party declared a general duty to help the heroic Red Army. The mobilization of the Republic's forces under the slogan, "Everything for Victory," was crowned with success. Assessing the results of the work on organizing the defense of the Republic, Lenin said, and only because the party was on guard, that the party was strictly disciplined, and because the authority of the party united all departments and institutions, and according to the slogan given by T.S.K., as one person walked tens, hundreds, thousands, and ultimately millions, and only because unheard of sacrifices were brought in, only so the miracle that happened could happen. That is why, despite the twofold, threefold and fourfold campaign of the Entente imperialists and imperialists of the whole world, we were able to win. Lenin, Collected Works, Volume XXV, p. 96. The working class, the working masses of the peasantry, put forward their best sons, staunch fighters and organizers of victories on the military and economic fronts. Comrades Frunze, Voroshilov, Molotov, Orjonikidze, Kaganovich, Kirov, Mikoyan, etc., to the forefront in the struggle for socialism. The revolution has brought up such legendary proletarian generals as Chaplyavinskers. In the defeat of hordes of interventionists, White Guards, in the victorious outcome of the Civil War, the great role of the leader and organizer belongs to Comrade Stalin. Between 1918 and 1920, wrote Comrade Voroshilov, Comrade Stalin was perhaps the only person whom the Central Committee threw from one battlefront to the other, choosing the most dangerous and most terrible places for the revolution. Where there was relatively calm and prosperous, where we had successes, there was not visible Stalin. But where, for a number of reasons, the Red Armies cracked, where the counter-revolutionary forces, developing their successes, threatened the very existence of Soviet power, where confusion and panic could at any moment turn into helplessness and catastrophe. Comrade Stalin appeared there. He did not sleep nights. He organized. He took in his firm hands the leadership. He broke down, was merciless, and created a fracture, healed the situation. Voroshilov, Stalin and the Red Army, Gospolitas. 1939, pages 8-9. During the foreign occupation in Ukraine, the regime of military dictatorship was established, preserving for appearance the bourgeois landlord Voda, who was soon replaced by the government of Hetman Skoropadsky. The interventionists plundered the country's wealth. They restored landed property to the land, returned factories and factories to the capitalists, ruthlessly plundered the peasants, taking away their grain and livestock and exporting them abroad. The gallows, shootings of workers and peasants, the destruction of entire villages, the ruthless exploitation of workers and peasants, that's what the invaders brought to Ukraine. In the territory captured by the Whites, all the workers' organizations created by the Soviet government in factories were liquidated. Commissions were created on the denationalization of industry, trade and banks. At the same time, of course, the workers' control was abolished and capitalism's arbitrariness was restored. Kolchak demagoguically promised to provide the peasants with land after the victory over the Bolsheviks. In fact, he equipped punitive expeditions against the peasantry, destroying entire villages, mass shooting and flogging of peasants. With animal cruelty, the Kolchak people also dealt with revolutionary workers. In the Yekaterinburg province, for example, not less than 20% of the population has been flogged. More than 8,000 people were tortured and executed in Verkhotorsky district. The shot-down workers of Kyzylov's mines were thrown into mines. In this way, at least 2,000 people were buried in the mines. The Working Revolution in the Urals. Episodes and Facts, Ekaterinburg, 1921, p. 76, 77. The workers and peasants of the Far East suffered not a little from the Japanese interventionists. The invaders plundered the Far Eastern region, exported fish, coal, oil, timber, hijacked ships. Thousands of the best people were tortured and shot, burned alive in the chimneys of locomotives, in houses and barns. In the Amur region on March 22, 1919 in the village of Ivanovka, the Japanese were taught unprecedented bloody massacre. People were shot from machine guns. A group of peasants and 30 people was locked up in a barn and burned. Those trying to escape through the roof were shot. In this nightmarish beating, the active role was played by the Russian White Guards. As a result of the massacre of Japanese rapists, 257 people were killed, 10 of them women and 4 children. 196 rural householders were left homeless. 160 families lost all able-bodied members and about 1,000 children remained orphans. It's only in one village. The same was the case in the villages of the Amur region, Sahatino, Mazanovo, Krasny Yar, Pavlovka, Vasilivka, Tambovka, Andrionivka, etc. White Guard rulers could not create any solid rear, while the Red Army had a solid rear, for the Soviet government brought complete liberation to the people. It enjoyed their full confidence and support. The armed forces of the Soviet Republic, often devoid of essentials, defeated numerous enemies, astounding the world with their valor and heroism. Along with victories on the fronts, there was also an internal strengthening of Soviet power in its struggle against the subversive work of the counter-revolution. In the period of the fierce civil war, the Cheka fulfilled its gigantic task of combating counter-revolution, sabotage, conspiracy, espionage and sabotage. One of the greatest achievements of the Cheka is the unveiling of the White Guard plot, organized in Petrograd in the spring of 1919 by agents of foreign powers. The masses learned more from the experience of the struggle to appreciate the tremendous advantages of the Soviet system. Soviet power gave freedom and equality to the people. The White Guards and the interventionists bore national oppression. Soviet power gave land to the peasants, freed them from landlord oppression and exploitation. The White Guard gangs and interventionists restored landlord property, the power of feudal landlords. Soviet power transferred the factories to the working class and freed the workers from the arbitrariness of the exploiters capitalists. The White Guard gangs and interventionists again restored the economic and political rule of the capitalists and the system of wage slavery. The working class of Soviet Russia united millions of working peasants around itself and on this basis ensured victory over the internal counter-revolution and interventionists. The most important task of the working class was to establish the correct relations between the two main classes of our country, the working class and the peasantry. An exceptionally important role in the solution of this problem was played by the Eighth Party Congress, which met in March 1919 and was a turning point in the party's policy toward the average peasantry. The party's policy, outlined by the Eighth Congress, played a decisive role in the successful outcome of the Civil War. In a well-known article, Valuable Recognition of Peterim Sorokin, written in November 1918, Lenin, analyzing the reasons for the turn of petty bourgeois elements toward Soviet power, pointed out that this turn is not an accident. It is prepared by the course of the development of the revolution, the strengthening of the positions of the dictatorship of the working class and the weakening of the positions of the imperialist predators. The collapse of German imperialism, the revolution in Germany and other countries, the exposure of Anglo-French imperialism, and the exposure of bourgeois democratic illusions of petty bourgeois elements created a turn of these elements toward Soviet power. On the basis of an analysis of the distribution of class forces in the country, Lenin formulated his historical slogan of an alliance of the working class with the middle peasantry with support for the poor. To be able to reach agreement with the average peasant, not for a moment refusing to struggle with the kulaks and firmly relying only on the poor, this is the task of the moment, for it is now the turn in the average peasantry in our direction is inevitable. The same applies to the handicraftsman, to the artisan, and to the worker, who has been placed in the most petty bourgeois conditions or who has retained the most petty bourgeois views, and to many employees, and to officers, and especially to the intelligentsia in general. Lenin, Soch. Volume XXIII, p. 294. Socialism is the abolition of classes, but to destroy classes, as Lenin pointed out, it is not enough just to overthrow the bourgeoisie, it is also necessary to destroy the difference between the working class and the peasantry. This task cannot be solved immediately, and it cannot be solved by violence. The working class, carrying out its revolutionary dictatorship, suppresses the exploiters, applies violence against class enemies. Violence towards the middle peasantry is the greatest harm. Lenin, Collected Works, Volume XXIV, p. 167, Lenin points out, the average peasantry in a communist society will only be on our side when we facilitate and improve the economic conditions of his life. If we could give 100,000 first-class tractors tomorrow, supply them with gasoline, equip them with machinists, you know perfectly well that while this is fantasy, the average peasant would say, I am for communism, i.e., for communism, IBID, p. 170. A firm alliance between the working class and the peasantry for a joint war against the landlords and capitalists was a military-political alliance of workers and peasants. This military-political alliance of the working class and the working masses of the middle peasantry was the basis of the victories of the Soviet Republic during the Civil War. The Eighth Congress of the party proposed that the whole party be guided by the principle, to be able to reach agreement with the middle peasant, not forgetting for a moment the struggle against the kulak. The Congress adopted a resolution condemning the anti-Median practice that violates, in the most brutal way, not only all the decrees of Soviet power and all its policies, but all the basic principles of communism, indicating the agreement of the proletariat with the middle peasantry, VKP in the resolutions and decisions of Congresses, conferences and plenums of the Central Committee, Part I, p. 315. Struggling for the implementation of its program of the socialist transformation of the countryside, encouraging the association of peasants in communes, artels and partnerships, the party waged a ruthless struggle against excessive haste in this matter, against direct or indirect coercion. One of the sources of the strength of the socialist revolution and the condition for the victories of the workers and peasants' Red Army over interventionists and White Guard hordes was the Leninist-Stalinist national policy. The nationalist bourgeoisie, relying on the Mensheviks, socialist revolutionaries, Dashnaks, Mussovites and other counter-revolutionary parties, fomenting nationalist propaganda, sought to restore capitalism and the power of the landlords and the bourgeoisie under the guise of self-determination. With the help of the Western imperialists, the Ukrainian, Don, Armenian, Georgian counter-revolution during the Civil War tried to create independent bourgeois landlord states against the will of the workers and peasants and in their struggle against them. Bukharin acted together with his accomplices against the Leninist-Stalinist national policy, against one of the foundations of this only correct policy, the right of nations to self-determination. The Trotskyite Beloukov advocated the abolition of nations. Comrades Trotsky and Bukharin, distorting the national policy of the Soviet government, tried to conduct through the People's Commissariat of Education the Russification of national schools. Establishing the right relations between the various nationalities inhabiting the land of Soviets was the first prerequisite for strengthening the multinational state, which is our Soviet state. The correct policy of Soviet power, and above all on peasant and national issues, ensured the victory of the working class over the united forces of the counter-revolution. The military situation required special measures in the field of economic life. These measures could be carried out with the full support of them from the working people of our homeland. The most important task of this period was the correct organization of the food business. It was necessary to completely centralize the procurement and distribution of products in order to meet primarily the urgent needs of the Red Army, workers' factories and factories working for the defense of the Republic. Such centralization was necessary to stop the speculation in grain at the root, to deprive the class enemy of the economic base. Finally, it was dictated by a sharp reduction in the production of bread in the country due to the fall of the productive forces of agriculture and the exclusion of the main grain regions by the White Guard. The main provisions of the food policy of the Civil War period are formulated by Lenin in the following points. A. Accounting and state distribution according to the class principle. B. Monopoly on basic foodstuffs and C. The transfer of the supply of supplies from private hands to the hands of the state. Lenin, Works, Volume XXIII, p. 466. The food policy of the Soviet government, strict centralization of production and distribution management were the object of violent attacks by all the enemies of the revolution: the Mensheviks, socialist revolutionaries, Trotskyists and Bukharinites. Lenin attacks bourgeois theoreticians who reproached the communists for allegedly stopping the production by their policy of expropriation of expropriators and centralization of command economic heights in the hands of the state. Whoever says this, Lenin wrote, is either a complete idiot, even if he calls himself thrice the leader of the Bern International, or a traitor to the workers. In a country that is ruined, the first task is to save the worker. The first productive force of all mankind is the worker, the worker. If he survives, we will all save and restore. I. Bede. Volume XXIV, p. 298. The organization of industrial management was also subordinated to the task of defending the Republic and the proper distribution of products related to this task. The essence of the system of Glavkism, formed during the Civil War, was the centralization of industrial management. Supplying with fuel, raw materials, cash, All functions of accounting and distribution were centralized under the jurisdiction of the Supreme Council of National Economy. The Soviet Republic, surrounded by enemies, was forced to strain all the forces of the country in order to repel the furious attacks of the White Guards and expel the interventionists. The October Socialist Revolution shook the foundations of capitalism and served as a powerful impetus for the revolutionary movement in capitalist and semi-colonial countries. The growing sympathy of the workers and soldiers of the capitalist states towards the Soviet Republic destroyed the Entente's plans to strangle the Soviet Republic on its own. The British imperialists had to remove the troops operating on the Arkhangelsk front. French sailors under the direction of Comrade Marty in April 1919 on the ship Waldeck Rousseau raised an uprising against the interventionists. "This is our first and fundamental victory," Lenin said at the 7th All-Russian Congress of Soviets, "because this is not only a military victory, but not a military victory at all, but a victory in fact of the international solidarity of the working people, for whose sake we began the whole revolution. We defeated the Entente by taking away the workers and peasants dressed in soldiers' uniforms." Lenin, SOCH, Volume XXIV, p. 595. During the Civil War, the USSR experienced a workers' revolution in Finland, rice riots in Japan, 1918, revolutions in Austria and Germany, 1918, the Proletarian Revolution in Hungary, 1919, the victory of the Soviets in Bavaria, 1919, the Bourgeois National Revolution in Turkey, revolutionary actions and the seizure of enterprises by workers in Italy, revolutionary uprisings in the fleets and armies of the capitalist countries, France, England, etc., etc. On the basis of the growing revolutionary movement in the years of the Civil War, a great party of the World Community was created and strengthened UNISMA, 3 Communist International. The struggle of the workers and peasants of Russia against foreign interventionists was directly supported by the millions of advanced proletarians of the capitalist countries. In the beginning of 1919 in England there were performances of workers in defense of the Soviet Republic. At the same time, the General Confederation of Labor in France put forward a demand for an end to the intervention. In Germany, at the Congress of the Spartacists courageously rose Rosa Luxemburg, who branded the treacherous behavior of the Scheidemanites. The British workers prevented their bourgeoisie from rendering direct military assistance to the Polish princes. The workers created the Councils of Action and proclaimed their militant slogan of solidarity, "Hands off Soviet Russia." French and German workers refused to ship the equipment and weapons that the imperialists sent to Poland. The Italian railway workers, in order to prevent the sending of military materials to Poland, declared a general strike. In August 1920, an international Congress of Seamen issued a decree to prevent the transport of military cargo to Poland. The same decision was adopted by the International Union of Transport Workers. The port workers in Danzig refused to unload the Dutch steamer with the military cargo for Poland and, threatening with a general strike, ensured that the steamship had left unloaded. Czechoslovak railroad workers drove trains with military cargo for the Pan-Poland to dead ends. The main condition for the victory of Soviet power over the exploiters was the correct leadership of our party, the party of Lenin and Stalin. Armed with the Marxist-Leninist revolutionary theory, tempered in the fire of 3 revolutions, the Bolshevik Party secured the solution of the greatest historical task, the rallying of the dozens of the peoples of Russia that had been oppressed by Tsarism in a single-state union, created and consolidated an indestructible alliance between the working class and the peasantry. She organized millions of working people to actively participate in the construction of a new life, created the armed force of the Socialist Revolution, the Workers' and Peasants' Red Army, and ensured the victory over foreign interventionists and White Guard generals. The Soviet government managed to create an unprecedented in the history of the Red Army, capable of resisting the more powerful in technical terms, the armies of the interventionists. It is an army of liberated workers and peasants, an army of liberated peoples of the Soviet Republic, an army brought up in the spirit of internationalism. The Soviet government managed to create new cadres, for the absence of which the enemies counted, at the cost of an extraordinary strain of all forces to ensure the work of the rear, to supply the Red Army, to overcome the horrors of hunger, to save the country, to defend its independence. The heroic Red Army won because the policy of the party of Lenin, Stalin, and Soviet power was correct. This policy was in the interests of the people accepted it as their own policy and supported it to the end. At the same time, the policy of the interventionists was an anti-people, predatory, just in the interests of a handful of exploiters, and therefore their armies, despite their technical preponderance, suffered defeat. The Red Army was closely welded to the people and enjoyed its boundless love and support. Soviet power was able to raise the whole rear, to turn the entire country into a single military camp. Guided by the party of Lenin and Stalin, the Red Army was the bearer of the best Bolshevik traditions. Every Red Army soldier was aware of the correctness of the goals and tasks of the war. This consciousness was a powerful source of unprecedented heroism and selflessness. Struggling for the cause of the socialist revolution, the Red Army was not alone. Its successes aroused the sympathy and support of millions of workers and peasants in the rear of the White Guard, rulers, and in all capitalist countries. In the most acute and decisive moments, the struggle of the proletarians of the whole world against imperialism was a serious help to the Red Army, the Soviet Republic. The victory of the Red Army over the interventionists is a victory of world historical significance. The victory of the dictatorship of the working class over the forces of imperialism, the victory of the cause of the communist movement over international opportunism. Not only the imperialists were defeated, but also their accomplices, the parties of the Mensheviks, socialist revolutionaries, anarchists, and nationalists. The period of civil war and intervention was a period of political death of these parties and the final triumph of the Communist Party in the Soviet country. History of the CPSU, B. Short course, page 236. The historical experience of organizing the victories of the working class of the USSR during the Civil War fully confirmed the vitality and correctness of the Marxist-Leninist teaching, confirmed the mobilizing and transforming role of the revolutionary ideas that the masses possessed,